Well, everyone, I have to say this is something I've been looking forward to since I started this channel. Folks know that my first love, in many ways, and sort of the domain of esotericism, was alchemy. And Professor Principe, it was finding your work and the work of some of your colleagues that made it feel like I could engage with alchemy in an academically, in an intellectually rigorous way. And all that's to say that so much of the work that I do here as Esoterica is built upon the foundation of scholarship like yours. And I just want to extend a thanks, not just from me, but I think so many people that watch this channel. Over 500,000 people subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Thank you for your years of scholarship. Thank you for the work you've done. And thank you for allowing people like me to connect to alchemy in a way that's so profoundly rigorous. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for reading what I write and making good use of it. I appreciate that very much.
So I'm curious, how did you become interested in Latin? I imagine many chemists, they hear the word alchemy and they run the other way. Uh, how did how did you come to run toward alchemy and not the other way?
Well, it's an odd story. I was interested in chemistry from a very young age. Had the little basement laboratory, did explosions in the backyard, that sort of thing when I was a high schooler. And so I used to haunt the public libraries looking for books about chemistry so I could learn more. And one day I was in a public library I think in Bloomfield, New Jersey, if I remember correctly. And as I was looking through the chemistry, I ran across books on the history of chemistry. And there was a book I remember called Arts of the Alchemists. I think I have a copy of it. And I pulled it down and was just fascinated by the way that different people at different times and places would look at and interpret and engage with the world in different ways. And I began thinking about, where do ideas come from? And I do remember there was one illustration in that book that was a reproduction of a medieval or early modern text. I don't remember it this distance what that was. And it was in Latin and there was some marginalia. And I read through that because I was taking Latin at the time. And I thought, gee, I wonder if anybody has ever tried, redoing these kind of experiments that are described in these alchemical texts to see, what actually happens. So I guess if you take that story to its logical conclusion, it means my entire career has been spent answering one question. So maybe I'm not a very broad scholar after all.
I think you're quite broad. Although, I think even Heidegger once said that every philosopher has the one idea. And so I think, that's lucky too, if you get the one idea. And so I think that the fact that you may have landed on the one idea is really impressive. And a big part of what you've done is recreate so much of what we thought and for so long was just superstition or conjurations, or basically, their alchemists were akin to conjurers or something. And what you've done is shown, no, that's not the case at all. There is a rigorous experimental side to the world and the practice of the alchemists. And that's to be contrasted with what the world, in many ways, that you inherited, the way the alchemy was understood. This is the world of the Jungian interpretation of alchemy as a psychological process of individuation, or the Atwoodian sort of perennialist philosophical idea that basically what's happening there was a kind of spiritual process, or Eliada, and the list goes on. So insofar as that sort of one historiography, we might call it, and you're accredited, are blamed, depending on who you're around, I imagine, with developing what is now referred to as the new historiography of alchemy. How did you develop that new historiography, and what does that new historiography mean to you?
Mm-hmm. Well, back in the story I just related happened in the late 1970s. And at that time, I scoured university books, libraries and other places trying to find something out about alchemy that would help answer my questions. And of course, pretty much the only thing that there was at that time was the sort of more Eliadian, Jungian, Atwood type of interpretations, which I just couldn't find them satisfying because, I had enough Latin that I was able to read some of the original texts when I could get my hands on facsimiles or something like that. And there just seemed to be this disconnect between the two. Um, I found even at that age, I was unimpressed by the idea that there was sort of one universal answer to alchemy, whether it was in China, India, or Europe, or the Arabian Peninsula, and whether it was 2,000 years ago or yesterday. I had a hard time dealing with that. Now, what happened is that I went to the University of Delaware as an undergraduate in the early 1980s, and they had a magnificent collection in history of chemistry, history of alchemy, that they very generously gave me free run of. I don't know if this would happen anymore today, but in the 1980s, you had an undergraduate who could read a few languages and was interested in books. They just sort of let me have the run of the shelves. And so that is, in fact, where I started understanding the diversity that was within alchemy, and actually started trying to do a lot of the experiments to figure out what did these people see? What were they on about? What were they trying to do?
think that's I think that's a fascinating aspect of it. Is I think that one of the things perhaps that you and I share in common is that we were reading them in Latin, and I think that's an interesting thing to think that doesn't happen with alchemy. Is that we often see the pictures, and the pictures are very evocative.
Yes.
But when I tell people, I say this often, when you the vast majority of the time when you're looking at an alchemical text in the Middle Ages or early modern period, you're seeing a wall of text. You're not seeing these evocative pictures,
That's
and
it.
and it so misrepresents what it's the iceberg effect. The iceberg is those tiny amount of evocative pictures. The rest is a huge mountain of text, and I think that to your point, most of those texts go unread, mostly because people are unable to read them.
Right. Or what happens are the evocative images, which are, of course, very beautiful, get taken entirely out of their context. And if you look through the historical development of alchemy, it's always the text that comes first, and the images are a later um, derivative from the text. So, Basil Valentine's 12 Keys, first publication has no images. The images come later in the second edition. And so I found, published in the 1960s and 70s and into the 80s, and occasionally even still today, you find the picture books of alchemy where these pictures, which are great to look at, but decontextualized and often given explanations that are completely at odds with what the text in which they were originally embedded has to say.
That's right, and even sometimes copied wrongly over time, where by the time you get them, they're in some 1970s version of something that has been so amputated from its original context. And this is something we'll come back to with John of Rupescissa when we get to his text in the Liber Lucis, and how it's been transmitted and corrupted in many ways, and you're doing the work of restoring it as much as it is possible. Alchemy is part of this sort of field, as much as we want to say it, of Western esotericism, sort of broadly construed, whatever that is. And it's a new field. You were coming up and sort of the heyday of this with other scholars working in other domains of this, like Walter Hanegraaff and other folks. You were working on this alchemy side of things, and because it's such a new field, and because alchemy, magic, etc., is associated with the occult or whatever, I'm wondering, in specifically the scientific fields that you worked in chemistry, did you get pushback? Did you get institutional kind of oh, that's our alchemist. That's the oh, that's just the weirdo alchemist down there doing his alchemy stuff. Did you get any kind of pushback like that as you were coming up through the ranks?
Yeah, I sure did. Early on, and it came from many different directions, from regular historians as well, who thought, my God, what are you doing? Sometimes from scientists. I must say that I mentioned the University of Delaware. There I found a whole lot of support for what I was doing from both chemists and historians. There was a famous historian of chemistry there by the name of John Beer, who was a great help. And the chemistry department let me do stuff in their laboratories. But yeah, I did. And the pushback came in a few different ways. There were some people who, when they found out what I was working on, they got this look in their eyes, like, I should find someone less questionable to talk to right now, and they'd wander off. So there was that. There was also a great deal of pushback when I tried to question the sort of reigning historiography uh, on um, on the interpretation of alchemy, the sort of spiritual interpretation. Um, and also, even from some historians of science, I must say, I was once accused of not having a sense of humor because I wanted to take alchemical writing seriously to see what people were actually doing in laboratories. And I'm delighted to say that that's vanished now. So good.
Yeah, thank God. I mean, it's
Yeah.
interesting that a lot of the pushback, what I'm hearing is that you're getting it from history primarily, and not so much from practical chemists. Where would you say that the actual chemists were more curious than the historians?
At one time, yeah, actually, I think the chemists were actually interested in sort of extending their pedigree in a sense, if I can say
Mhm.
it that way, of extending the history of chemistry. Because, many of the other sciences, like astronomy, well, you have the Greeks and the Babylonians with astronomy. Well, what do the chemists have, right? There were many histories of chemistry that were written in the 20th century that started with Dalton at the beginning of the 19th century, or at best with Lavoisier, or maybe with Boyle in the 17th century. Um, but to push the history of chemistry back through the Middle Ages to antiquity, I think a lot of chemists responded positively to that. That it said good things about their discipline. And let's face it, the chemists have often felt as sort of latecomers to the table of academia,
Mhm.
and they responded very well to that and showed a lot of interest, honestly.
And I have to say that to them, that it's a credit, that the scientists were being scientists, and the humanities people were not being so scientific, which
That was
is
often the case.
it's often the case. I've experienced that as well. Many people are much more interested in, when I tell them I'm studying something in alchemy, it's my scientist friends who are like, "Oh, tell me more." Um, so it's a again, it's an unfortunate and surprising kind of turnaround. You mentioned Robert Boyle,
Mhm.
so and a lot of your work has been on the early modern period,
Right.
and I'm curious, um, one of the big things that the narrative that gets taught, I learned right, was that back before Robert Boyle and the skeptical chemist, there was just superstition, and then corpuscles, and we're done. The watershed has occurred, the Messiah has come, and the skeptical chemist has reigned. Tell us a little bit about how your work has greatly complicated that story, and maybe even really undone
Yeah.
it. Between Robert Boyle and Helmont and other kinds of people, what would you say has been the real thrust of your work in showing how that way of telling um, the birth of chemistry has really misrepresenting history?
Yeah. Well, I think much of the earlier narrative came out of a particular kind of what we call the triumphalist narrative of the progress of science, that, everything in the past, we're all so much smarter now. Where did that start? And various people picked different people, often based on nationalistic concerns. The French start with Lavoisier and the English start with Boyle, right? But that kind of triumphalist narrative is so it often makes a good story, but it doesn't make anything more than a story. It doesn't make history. So maybe I should mention how I actually got interested in Boyle in the first place, because I never intended to work on Boyle, actually. The first project I was working on was with Basil Valentine, and I was working on his 12 keys. And it was pretty clear after reading his texts and some of the commentaries that he was dealing with volatilizing gold early on in the 12 keys. So, having some training as a chemist, I went to the chemical literature to find out something about the volatilization of gold. And I came across a paper from the early 20th century, a paper written when chemists were also pretty good historians of their own discipline, in which there was a reference to Boyle. Now it was a scientific paper. I don't remember what chemical journal it was in, but at any rate, um, it made a reference to Boyle, and I went to look at Boyle, and that's when it suddenly struck me. Without saying it, what Boyle is describing here is he's doing the same thing I'm doing. He's trying to figure out what Basil Valentine's 12 keys were all really about. And that just opened the floodgates to start reading Boyle, not from the present backwards, but from Boyle's own past forwards. So I like to say, I said in my book, Aspiring Adept, I saw a different Boyle because I snuck up on him from behind. That is, I came from the 16th century and the early 17th century to Boyle, rather than trying to say, oh, well, he's famous to a modern chemist because he did X. So anyway, what happened was, is I went to the Royal Society of London later that about a year later, and looked at his unpublished papers. And once you look at his unpublished papers, it's clear that he is taking alchemy very, very seriously, and working on it throughout his life, from his very earliest forays into practical chemistry, right up until his deathbed, when he's bequeathing in his will these various alchemical materials he's collected to different people who will appreciate them. So it puts Boyle back in context. He's not a 20th century person that was accidentally born in the 17th century. He's very much a 17th century person, interested in looking both forward but backward as well at the accomplishments of his predecessors and trying to understand them.
And I think that's one of the things that really has become apparent in the 20th century, is that the more we drill down into these characters, first with Newton and Boyle, and that we begin to realize that these clean distinctions between chemistry and alchemy and all these things become extremely muddy. And that's history. I think that the famous quote, "That which leaves out the mess is not history." and of course, these characters are people who are products of their time. Now you've rewound the clock even more. Your academic interests have now rewound several more centuries back, into the 14th century. In many ways, closer to the very birth of alchemy, at least in the Western world, after the introduction of alchemy into Europe in 1144. I want to know a little bit about sort of what took you to John of Rupescissa and to his Liber Lucis. What there's a lot of text back there. You have the entire pseudo-Lullian corpus. There's some Arnold of Villanova, as much as he wrote any of that. There's a lot of text back there. But what drew you to John and to the Liber Lucis?
A couple of things. First of all, I have to admit that for much of my career, I've been a frustrated medievalist. I always really wanted to be a medievalist, but as I just mentioned, I started working on Boyle, so that was the 17th century. Then I started working on the 18th century and published a book on that. And recently, I did a little book on the continuation of alchemy into the 19th and the 20th centuries. And I just thought, oh, I'm getting too modern for my tastes. I need to get back to the real stuff in the Middle Ages. So I wanted to do a medieval project. Now, why John of Rupescissa? Simply because I took down those two big volumes of the Bibliotheca Chimica Curiosa, 1702, and looked at what was in there by John. And well, I ran across two short treatises, the Liber Lucis, as it's called, and the De Confectione Vere Lapidis Philosophorum. And it's the same text, just with two different titles, and with barely a single sentence in full between them. So two different versions of essentially the same text. So I began wondering, well, which one is really John's and which one is corrupted, or did he write two different versions? And, that would have remained probably an idle curiosity if it weren't for the fact that in those published texts, these were published in the 16th century, there were a couple of lines that made it seem that John was using principles in his experimentation that, in general, the history of chemistry attributes their origins to a much later time, not to the Middle Ages, to the 18th, the 17th, or at best the 16th century, but definitely not the 14th. And so that set me on a quest of trying to figure out, is this really authentic John of Rupescissa? What did he really write? So that's when I decided the only way to do this, I have to do a critical edition. And that's what I've been working on and have now finished, which will soon be published, a critical edition of this very short text. It's only about 3,500 words, so it was a good one to start with if I wanted to do more critical editions. So this critical edition of the Liber Lucis, which turns out the critical edition is full of so much interesting stuff. It will keep others busy now, even after its publication, and my own comment on it.
And I think that's the great thing about this work. And my understanding from listening to some of your lectures, and I haven't read the critical edition yet, I'm looking forward to reading it, is that part of what you've discovered is that by both recreating his work forensically, but also doing some close reading etymologically, that these two things are actually informing each other, that you're learning important things about what's going on in the text by recreating it, and by recreating it, you're learning how to read the text properly, because as folks may know, the Liber Lucis comes down to us in a lot of redactions, of which some are quite corrupt, and it's hard to know which ones are the most reliable. But I'm really curious if you could say something about how the forensic work, but also the close reading work, have actually done some of the work of allowing you to reconstruct what might have been John's original meaning.
Right. The two really do go together hand in hand. It's pretty remarkable. So the published versions often have interpolations of sort of extra ingredients or other processes or other operations that really, when you read them, they don't really make sense. And so working out the critical edition, removes those sort of accretions or glosses that got inserted into the text. But doing the replications or the recreations, the reworkings, really helped me translate correctly, because I would have made quite a number of mistakes in translation, and probably not been able to solve a couple puzzles if I hadn't actually tried to see the kind of results that John himself saw. So I'll give you one very quick example. There's one place where he gets mercury out of a process, and he calls it mercury marchidus. Now, marchidus is an adjective in Latin. It's not a very common adjective, but it describes sort of an animal that's tired or languid, exhausted, something like that. And it's like, what on earth is exhausted mercury? That just makes no sense to me. Until I did the process and discovered that the mercury, because of the way it's precipitated out of a solution, gets covered in this sort of dusty detritus that encapsulates its little tiny globules. And so instead of running together into a single mobile liquid, as mercury usually is, it looks like a powder. And so, yeah, it's exhausted. It no longer runs. It's no longer argentum vivum, living silver. It's sort of dead at this point, the way it looks, or at least very, very tired. So that's just one example of how that work helped.
That's a fantastic example of, again, like how the forensic work and the etymological work go hand in hand. But also, and this goes back to your point that you made a moment ago, that one of the interesting things that you've also discovered is there's perhaps a disconnect between the kind of chemistry being taught in the universities, right, in which chemicals have accidents, a la Aristotle, and those accidents can change, whereas it seems like what you've discovered, and it's pretty incredible, is that John seems to have come upon, or has inherited, or knows about. Could you say more about that? That he seems to have come upon a chemical process that is that wouldn't be discovered till quite some time later.
Yeah, the interesting thing is that once you have a working process, and I should just say, I haven't mentioned it. I mean, was the critical edition that took me 2.5 years to do worth it? Well, yeah, I discovered that the published editions omit about 50% of John's original text. So there's a lot more John to read there now. So yes, but once you have a decent process and you're seeing what John is doing, John is unusually interested in trying to prove to you that his theories about what's happening at the invisible level of transformation of substances is really true, that he's really gotten what he claims he's gotten. So he does these various tests and demonstrations. And what I came to realize, what I saw sort of if I may say so, in a glass darkly in the printed editions, was that he was using certain principles like the conservation of weight to guide his practices. And that's not something that is connected with the 14th century. Weight, for example, matter is conserved for Aristotle and the scholastics, but weight is not. So the question then naturally arises, where did John get this from? Why does he trust this? It obviously was contrary to what, at least we think, he was taught at the University of Toulouse while he was there doing at least a baccalaureate and perhaps a master's degree. So what it does is, by focusing on the practices, there seems to be some kind of tension between the sort of scholarly academic discourse of material transformation and then what's really going on in people's laboratories or workshops when they're working with materials. And that's an interesting thing that we really haven't seen before in this context, in the context of material transformations of alchemy in the 14th century. So there's a lot more work to be done there, which I hope to be getting to at some point.
And I think that's a fascinating disjunction between scholastic theory and actual practical, what the chemists are doing in the labs. And I think that's an interesting kind of disjunction. So this is a place where I get a lot of pushback on the alchemy videos that I do. Because I am a follower of the new historiography, and that's how I present alchemy, and that's how I look at alchemy, even when I'm doing some of the work on spiritual alchemy that's been sort of working now in the sort of the early heterodox Protestant world. But one of the kickbacks that I pretty frequently get is, for many people, as I'm sure you know, alchemy is psychologically and spiritually important. The Atwoodian and Jungian paradigms are not just intellectual things for many people, they're spiritual. They're deeply spiritual for many people. And sometimes the new historiography is sort of accused a little bit of being a bull in a china shop, just sort of knocking down people's spiritualities and stuff like that. But what I want to ask you, and sort of go to the horse's mouth, I suppose, is, to your mind, how can these two paradigms work together, mutually inform one another? Does one fundamentally undercut the other? Does believing in one mean that discount the other, or can they actually work in a kind of harmony? And I'm kind of curious from that, from your perspective, not as a person who maybe believes in the Jungian or Atwoodian perspective, but do you, in your work, or do you think that those two things are mutually logically exclusive or in some kind of fundamental contradiction?
Yeah, I don't think they need to be in contradiction or mutually exclusive at all, because alchemy has a very, very long history. And certainly, things that Zosimus was doing in the 4th century is different from what George Starkey was doing in the 17th century, different from what people today who are practicing alchemy are doing. And that's fine. I think that the only intervention I would make is that, whereas I actually have read a lot of the Victorian occultists, and many of them I quite like, actually. It's a very interesting interpretation, but I'm just afraid that in general, Atwood's interpretation and Jung's interpretation, they're just not historically viable. As the historical record does not permit one to make the kind of blanket overall statements of alchemy as being predominantly a spiritual or an internal practice. Now, having said that, it's not like alchemy suddenly comes to an end on, January the 1st, 1900, or January the 1st, 1700, or whatever date you want. It's evolving. And so the way I like to think about it is, I acknowledge, and I know from people I know, that the kind of psychological and spiritual interpretations have been very helpful to some people. They're important parts of their lives, and that's great. And I think about it like the interpretation of a poem, in a sense, that different readers will read poems differently. And just because my reading is different from what someone else's reading is, doesn't make theirs bad. It only comes to an issue if I'm trying to find out, well, what did the author of the piece actually have in mind when he was writing it? Okay. Author's intent, it's important. But for a poem, it's also not everything. it's also how it's read later by other people, bringing their own experiences to it. So that's fine. So in fact, I did once have a very nice conversation and exchange with a Jungian about, so what do we salvage from Jung? We know that the historical approach, the historical claims are don't hold water anymore. But there's still things that could be salvaged that would be of use, whether in psychoanalysis or in people's personal lives. And fine, fine.
Yeah, I liken it in some ways to archaeology and faith and religion. That one's faith in Catholicism or Judaism are one thing, and then what you might find in the ground are often very different things. And it's an unfortunate reality for some people that we don't find walls at Jericho when there should be walls at Jericho. But does that mean that the all of faith must come crumbling down because we didn't find the walls that came crumbling down? Of course not. That these are two slightly different magisterium, and maybe they're doing very different things. So, and I think many people will be very happy to hear that the new historiography and what we might call the old historiography can still talk to each other in meaningful ways, in ways that don't negate the other and the value of the other. And I think that that's an important kind of dialectic intention that's well worth holding. And
Absolutely. Now, in fact, I can give you another example of this. A colleague of mine has written on how alchemy was used in the early modern period, the 16th, 17th century, by preachers as a source of metaphors, as a source of inspiration. And how is that different in a sense? They're taking this body of knowledge, not pursuing it the way most alchemists would have done, but deploying it in a particular way for rhetorical and spiritual purposes. And that's fine. That's just another way of seeing the richness that is within alchemy. I mean, really, the one thing that bothers me, and which is a criticism that's been made of some of my work, and I would like to say this, is that I've often been accused of being, quote, just a chemist who's just interested in the science that's in alchemy and discounting the philosophical and the religious. And I have no idea where people got that from in my writings. Please, someone tell me where that is. Yes, I have paid particular attention to trying to figure out what alchemists were doing on a day-to-day basis in their laboratory, but I have never chopped off the broad vision of alchemy. In fact, that's why I find it so interesting. I've never chopped it off into just some kind of dull laboratory operations without all the deeper connotations and multivalency of the alchemical concepts.
Which I agree. I've never seen that in your work or Bruce Moran's work or a lot of folks who have done that work. Bill Newman. I've never seen that that kind of like, oh, we're going to amputate all the other stuff that it's just not just the chemistry stuff. And yeah, I get accused of this too when I do episodes on alchemy. They're like, oh, you should just rename it the not the new historiography, but the new puffers. That you guys aren't really you're just. I'm like, come on, guys! Like this is a weird kind of alchemical fundamentalism. Are we really gonna? I guess they have fundamentalism for other kind of religion. I imagine they have alchemical fundamentalists too.
Seems to be the age of fundamentalism. Oh dear.
It's what a dreadful
And if you want
idea.
to get away from that, alchemy is a great way to do it, because you can't be a fundamentalist really with alchemy. You have to know something about everything and understand things at so many different levels simultaneously.
One would hope. One would hope. Professor Principe, you made an amazing career studying this material, and I get a lot of viewers, and I get a lot of people asking me, how can we study alchemy? This is one of the problems with studying alchemy, is that if you just go into Amazon, as I'm sure you've done, and just put in the word alchemy, it's a real mixed bag. Let's call it that to be diplomatic. Every episode I do on alchemy, your work and other works of the new historiography, and also I include Atwood and other people too, because I want them to have access to that material as well. It's not for me to pick and choose how people connect to this literature. I try to make it available as much as I can, but having had the hindsight of spend a career getting into the real deep level of this material, what kind of tips would you give a budding alchemist? What you're looking back to you there in Baltimore, what would be the handful of tips that you would give yourself, um, who's hungry and interested in alchemy and really wants to get into it in a real way, as opposed to just sort of, looking at cool images and coffee table books, but really getting into the essence of alchemy?
Well, it sounds immodest to say so, but I did write a book for that purpose
Mhm.
called The Secrets of Alchemy, where for anybody who's seen it or not seen the book, I tried to write it at two different levels, where if you're just sort of interested in knowing what the modern thinking about alchemy is, you can read the text and that's fine. But I think about a third of the book are some pretty hefty footnotes and references that if there's a particular topic you're more interested in, you can go there to pursue it. So that's one possibility. There are some other very fine books by a number of scholars, both referenced there and just available. Um, I think there needs to be some level of what do we say discretion in what's being read, and I think read widely and make your own decisions at some level. I would say that my book Secrets of Alchemy probably needs another edition soon because there's been so much going on in the scholarly world about alchemy that some of it is honestly dated now, even though it came out 2013, I think. So it's just 10 years old. So anyway, um,
How
it
about
would
in
be
terms of like chemistry knowledge or Latin, or if you were to sort of like, if someone were wanting to reproduce chemically, forensically reproduce your career path, um, what kind of, if you're imagining sort of the zigzagging through a college campus, what would be the kind of things that you want to get under your belt, in terms of?
definitely languages.
Okay.
Um, and it doesn't, I mean, almost any languages would be useful. Latin, of course, German, French, Italian, or indeed, one of the places that we need to know so much more about is outside of Europe. So we know a reasonable amount about the Islamic world, but there's a great number of Arabic texts that are still inaccessible that we don't have good editions of. Even more so once we get further along to India, Tibet, China, where there's a lot of work to be done. So, please pick a language and dive in. A little bit of chemistry can help, but of course, what you want to do is really understand the full historical context. That is the whole cultural context of why is Chinese alchemy so different from European alchemy? How do things change? What are the characteristics of Islamic thought, for example, that make Arabic alchemy the way it is, so forth. So it's a question. The question you ask is sort of the same one that's asked of me as a professor of the history of science. How do you become a historian of science?
Mm-hmm.
Well, in point of fact, if you look at the students that come into our programs, they come from a wide variety of backgrounds, all of them bringing their own experiences to bear on the questions we have in common. So I don't think there's any one royal road to studying alchemy. And I'm more than happy to have people come in that have experiences and knowledge and expertise that I don't have, or that maybe nobody in the field currently has, to explore yet another dimension of a very complicated phenomenon.
And it's interesting that you mentioned Arabic, and that's something I also hype is Arabic and Persian. That I feel like in many ways the earliest 20th century was actually ahead of us in
Yes,
producing scholarship in Arabic and Persian than we are now. Which is, again, it shows you that the sort of idea that academia is always progressing is definitely not true. I think of early 20th century scholars were producing more Arabic Latin or Arabic alchemical texts than we are now, which I think is interesting and ironic.
that's right. And I mean, there's some reasons for that. I mean, you think about the work of Homeyard and Paul Krauss and many of the others, Ruska. Um, and I mean, part of it was, in some senses, and I don't want to be misunderstood here, in some senses, access to those kind of materials was a little bit easier in the early 20th century than it is now for a whole range of geopolitical reasons. I mean, Krauss was living in Cairo in the middle of World War II. Homeyard was in India for a while. Stapleton was in India for a while. And so the sort of footprint of Europeans in those parts of the world was a little bit stronger then, in a sense, than it is now. But now I think we have the tools. I wish there were more people in, let's say, Arabic-speaking countries, in India, in China as well, that would be interested in helping, do this kind of work. That's sort of the obvious place to start, I would think.
Yeah, and the post-colonial situation that's largely caused by the very people that colonized them is also, radically destabilized them and made it so that those folks, in Iraq are not really able to. They have a lot of other higher things in the priority than translating, Jabbat or whatever.
Right.
So yeah, you're right. It's a super complicated situation. And even I think of texts that we do have, like Bertha Lowe's collection of Greek alchemical texts that hasn't had a new edition in 100+ years now. It's amazing that we're still, dealing with that. That there hasn't been a new edition of that over 100 years now, I think. So,
well,
so
they are coming out sort of piecemeal, one at a time, I think. It's in a sense that actually much of the early work you mentioned was done by people who were chemists who were interested in their own history. Okay. And now it's sort of, that work is sort of being redone by philologists who have rather more philological expertise. So it's very painstaking work, certainly the kind of stuff of the Greek alchemy. Basically, we have very, very few sources, and they're very corrupt, and it's difficult. What is being done now that I find really exciting are the scholars who are putting together Greek fragments with Syriac fragments, with Arabic fragments, and trying to reconstruct some of these very early productions of alchemy.
Yeah, the work of On Pseudo-Democritus by Matteo.
Yes, by Matteo Martelli.
Matteo Martelli is just fantastic work. Yeah, I'm also extremely excited about that as well. So you've wrapped or nearly wrapped the project on the Liber Lucis, and so it's coming to publication soon. When it comes out, I'll make sure to include a link so folks can get access to it. I'm looking forward to reading it. Future projects, one door closes and five open in our line of work. What are some of the future projects that you're excited about?
Well, as is usual with academics, I can't finish one project without starting another one before the first one is finished. So I got so enthralled by John of Rupescissa, I decided I'm also doing a critical edition of the work, which is usually called De Quintessentia. Correct title actually is De Famulatu Philosophiae, the service of philosophy to the gospel. So I've already started collecting manuscripts of that work. In just a couple of weeks, I'm going off to three more places actually, to collect four more witnesses of it. That's going to be a somewhat longer and more arduous task because it's 10 times as long as the Liber Lucis. And I found now 100 manuscripts of the Liber Lucis, but of the De Famulatu, it's closer to 300. So
because it traveled as a pseudo-Elian text for a while too, right?
It was corrupted into one, the De Secretis Naturae. So I'm just doing the De Famulatu, the two books there. But one reason there are more copies is it was a medical work, and so there were obviously, from what I can tell from the manuscripts I found, there were a lot of physicians who said, "Oh, that sounds like an important work. Here's money to a copyist to go and copy it." Whether they ever read it or not, we don't know, which is very different from the Liber Lucis, which are almost all pretty scrappy copies with lots of marginalia. These were clearly working manuscripts, much more than the De Famulatu was. Anyway, so future projects, that's one. I think I'm going to stay in the Middle Ages for a little while. So there are a few other texts that we have in fragmentary or corrupt form that I would like to do critical editions of. I've sort of caught the bug of doing critical editions, and I think it's an important piece of work.
Especially with these texts, which have very, very troubled transmission histories. Like, very,
Incredibly, yeah. And the other thing that transmission history tells you is it tells you exactly who was transmitting, where it was transmitted to and from, and why, and how it was actually received and changed over time. So that tells us a lot about practice, which I'm very interested in. And I think also a career at my or a scholar at my stage of a career, doing critical editions is sort of a nice thing to do. Something that you can travel a lot and look at nice manuscripts and keep your hand in things.
That is a nice half-life for a scholar to to be in that world. I was actually just reading some manuscripts of the Quinta Essentia, and I love the part about the using the Quinta Essentia for driving out demons.
Yes.
There's a great section where he's like, "Oh, and the angel Raphael did exactly what I'm telling you to do by using the liver of the fish to
Yes.
Like,
right.
And it's such an interesting thing because we think of again, like, of Tobit, and I was like, what an interesting way of spinning that story. That we not only can we use exorcisms, we can also use this alchemical medical procedure. And this text is, again, for folks who haven't seen it, the episode yet, this influenced Bruchwag, and we think of Paracelsus as being the guy for whom medical alchemy is sort of the ground zero, but Rupescissa I think beat him to the punch many centuries previously.
Yeah, indeed he did. Indeed he did.
So, Professor Principe, again, thank you for taking the time to sit down with me and talk a little about your career and what you're working on and what you're going to be working on. I know that folks are going to be excited to see this conversation, and I guess I just want to end with what I began with. Scholarship matters so much to work like my own and other folks around us that just really, really have found your work to be not just intellectually fulfilling, but also it gave us a kind of way of connecting to alchemy in a way that felt intellectually rigorous. And I just want to extend again another humble thanks for the work that you've done, and also thanks in advance for the work that you'll be working on. Thank you.
Well, you're very welcome, and thank you for having me on your program here and ask me questions to talk about things I love to talk about. So, good luck to you in your own work, and soon we will be in touch with. You'll be hearing from me more things. I hope the Liber Lucis will come out this year. So
wonderful, inshallah. So thank you so much.